Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. Chapter 3. A Few More Lessons. I rose next morning with a feeling of hopeful exhilaration, in spite of the disappointments already experienced. But I found the dressing of Mary Ann was no light matter, as her abundant hair was to be smeared with pomade, plaited in 3 long tails, and tied with bows of ribbon, a task my unaccustomed fingers found great difficulty in performing. She told me her nurse could do it in half the time, and by keeping up a constant fidget of impatience, contrived to render me still longer. When all was done, we went into the schoolroom, where I met my other pupil, and chatted with the two till it was time to go down to breakfast. That meal being concluded, and a few civil words having been exchanged with Mrs. Bloomfield, we retired to the schoolroom again, and commenced the business of the day. I found my pupils very backward indeed, but Tom, though averse to every species of mental exertion, was not without abilities. Mary Ann could scarcely read a word, and was so careless and inattentive that I could hardly get on with her at all. However, by dint of great labour and patience, I managed to get something done in the course of the morning, and then accompanied my young charges out into the garden and adjacent grounds, for a little recreation before dinner. There we got along tolerably together, except that I found that they had no notion of going with me. I must go with them, wherever they chose to lead me. I must run, walk, or stand, exactly as it suited their fancy. This I thought was reversing the order of things, and I found it doubly disagreeable, as on this as well as subsequent occasions, they seemed to prefer the dirtiest places and the most dismal occupations. But there was no remedy. Either I must follow them, or keep entirely apart from them, and thus appear neglectful of my charge. To-day they manifested a particular attachment to a well at the bottom of the lawn, where they persisted in dabbling with sticks and pebbles for above half an hour. I was in constant fear that their mother would see them from the window, and blame me for allowing them thus to draggle their clothes and wet their feet and hands, instead of taking exercise, but no arguments, commands, or entreaties could draw them away. If she did not see them, someone else did. A gentleman on horseback had entered the gate, and was proceeding up the road. At the distance of a few paces from us he paused, and calling to the children in a waspish, penetrating tone, bade them keep out of that water. "Miss Grey," said he, "I suppose it is Miss Grey. I am surprised that you should allow them to dirty their clothes in that manner. Don't you see how Miss Bloomfield has soiled her frock, and that Master Bloomfield's socks are quite wet, and both of them without gloves? Dear, dear, let me request that in future you will keep them decent at least." So saying, he turned away, and continued his ride up to the house. This was Mr. Bloomfield. I was surprised that he should nominate his children Master and Miss Bloomfield, and still more so that he should speak so uncivilly to me, their governess, and a perfect stranger to himself. Presently the bell rang to summon us in. I dined with the children at 1, while he and his lady took their luncheon at the same table. His conduct there did not greatly raise him in my estimation. He was a man of ordinary stature, rather below than above, and rather thin than stout, apparently between 30 and 40 years of age. He had a large mouth, pale, dingy complexion, milky blue eyes, and hair the colour of a hempen cord. There was a roast leg of mutton before him. He helped Mrs. Bloomfield, the children, and me, desiring me to cut up the children's meat. Then, after twisting about the mutton in various directions, and eyeing it from different points, he pronounced it not fit to be eaten, and called for the cold beef. "What is the matter with the mutton, my dear?" asked his mate. "It is quite overdone. Don't you taste, Mrs. Bloomfield, that all the goodness is roasted out of it? And don't you see that all that nice red gravy is completely dried away?" "Well, I think the beef will suit you." The beef was set before him, and he began to carve, but with the most rueful expressions of discontent. "What is the matter with the beef, Mr. Bloomfield? I'm sure I thought it was very nice." "And so it was very nice. A nicer joint could not be, but it is quite spoiled," replied he, dolefully. "How so?" "How so? Why, don't you see how it is cut? Dear, dear, it is quite shocking." "They must have cut it wrong in the kitchen, then, for I'm sure I carved it quite properly here yesterday. No doubt they cut it wrong in the kitchen, the savages. Dear, dear, did ever anyone see such a fine piece of beef so completely ruined? But remember that in future, when a decent dish leaves this table, they shall not touch it in the kitchen. Remember that, Mrs. Bloomfield." Notwithstanding the ruinous state of the beef, the gentleman managed to cut out himself some delicate slices, part of which he ate in silence. When he next spoke, it was, in a less querulous tone, to ask what there was for dinner. "Turkey and grouse," was the concise reply. "And what besides?" "Fish." "What kind of fish?" "I don't know." "You don't know?" cried he, looking solemnly up from his plate, and suspending his knife and fork in astonishment. "No, I told the cook to get some fish. I did not particularize what." "Well, that beats everything. A lady professes to keep house, and doesn't even know what fish is for dinner. Professes to order fish, and doesn't specify what." "Perhaps, Mr. Bloomfield, you will order dinner yourself in future." Nothing more was said, and I was very glad to get out of the room with my pupils, for I never felt so ashamed and uncomfortable in my life for anything that was not my own fault. In the afternoon we applied to lessons again, then went out again, then had tea in the schoolroom, then I dressed Mary Ann for dessert, and when she and her brother had gone down to the dining-room, I took the opportunity of beginning a letter to my dear friends at home, but the children came up before I had half completed it. At 7 I had to put Mary Ann to bed, then I played with Tom till 8, when he too went, and I finished my letter and unpacked clothes, which I had hitherto found no opportunity for doing, and finally went to bed myself. But this is not a very favourable specimen of a day's proceedings. My task of instruction and surveillance, instead of becoming easier as my charges and I got better accustomed to each other, became more arduous as their characters unfolded. The name of governess, I soon found, was a mere mockery as applied to me. My pupils had no more notion of obedience than a wild, unbroken colt. The habitual fear of their father's peevish temper, and the dread of the punishments he was wont to inflict when irritated, kept them generally within bounds in his immediate presence. The girls, too, had some fear of their mother's anger, and the boy might occasionally be bribed to do as she bid him by the hope of reward. But I had no rewards to offer, and as for punishments, I was given to understand the parents reserved that privilege for themselves, and yet they expected me to keep my pupils in order.